It was one of those mornings when the courthouse seemed to hum with its own kind of energy. The building, with its tall stone columns and polished floors, carried an air of order and authority, yet beneath the shine there was always an edge of something darker. People shuffled in and out, some dressed in suits and carrying thick folders, others in street clothes, glancing nervously around as if the walls themselves might judge them. The sound of doors closing echoed through the halls, and the steady tapping of shoes mixed with the low murmur of conversations. It was a place where power lived, where some people found relief and others left with their lives shattered. On that day, no one knew how much the balance of that power was about to be tested. The courtroom itself was heavy with the scent of old wood and paper. The judge's bench loomed at the front, elevated like a throne. The flags behind it barely moved in the still air, and the worn leather chairs seemed almost alive with the history of all those who had sat there before. To the side, a row of police officers stood, their uniforms stiff and neat, watching everything with sharp eyes. The benches were filling slowly with people who had come either for duty or curiosity. Some knew they were about to face decisions that could break their families. Others simply wanted to watch, perhaps to feel grateful that, for now, it wasn't them. Among them was a boy who, at first glance, seemed out of place. He was young, maybe 16 at most, with a sharpness in his eyes that didn't quite match his age. His clothes were simple, nothing flashy, but he carried himself with an odd kind of confidence, like someone who knew he had walked into a lion's den but wasn't afraid of the teeth. Few people paid attention to him as he found a seat at the back. He didn't speak, didn't look around nervously like the others. Instead, he just waited, almost like he knew exactly how the day would unfold. The judge entered soon after, robes sweeping across the polished floor, his presence filling the room with authority. He was known for his stern manner, his dry humor that often cut deeper than his rulings, and his unwillingness to tolerate what he called nonsense. The gavel struck, the sound sharp and commanding, and the room fell quiet. To anyone watching, it was another day in court. But beneath the surface, something was already shifting, though no one could name it yet. Life before this moment had seemed ordinary enough for those involved. The judge had spent years in the same routine, arriving early, reviewing cases, sipping coffee that was always too bitter, and preparing to face another wave of defendants and lawyers. He had built a reputation for being both respected and feared. Those who stood before him often left feeling smaller, their confidence crushed by his quick wit or his cold stare. Power to him wasn't something he had to fight for. It was simply something he wore, like a second skin. The officers who patrolled the halls lived their own quiet routines too. They worked long hours, balancing duty with the strain it placed on their families. Some carried the weight of seeing the same faces return again and again, caught in a cycle the system never seemed to fix. They knew the smell of desperation better than anyone. Yet, even they could not have guessed how the day would unfold, or how quickly their sense of control could be shaken. And then there was the boy. To most people who knew him, his life looked unremarkable. He lived quietly, studied quietly, and rarely drew attention to himself. He didn't come from money or influence, and few teachers at his school would have called him extraordinary. But there was a part of him they never saw, a depth that reached far beyond his age. He had spent years studying things most adults found difficult, piecing together lessons, watching, listening. His mind was sharp in ways few understood, and though he looked like just another teenager, he carried secrets that even his closest neighbors would never believe. On the surface, nothing connected him to the courthouse that day. He wasn't there for jury duty and wasn't called as a witness. Yet he had walked in with a purpose, one no one around him could see. While the others thought about their own troubles, he was focused, calm, as though all of this had been part of his plan. If you looked closely, you could sense the first cracks beneath the ordinary. A sideways glance from the judge, a smirk that carried just a bit too much pride. A quiet intensity in the boy's eyes as he leaned forward slightly, watching, listening. The small details hinted at an imbalance waiting to break. The courtroom, so accustomed to its rigid order, seemed fragile like a house built on glass. Power hung in the air, invisible but heavy. It sat on the judge's shoulders, woven into the walls, embedded in every rule and every ritual. But in that same room sat a quiet force that no one yet recognized, hidden beneath the plain face of a teenager. Two worlds were about to collide, one built on years of authority and tradition, the other sharpened by curiosity, intelligence, and a daring confidence that no one could see coming. In that stillness before the storm, life felt normal. People shifted in their seats, whispered to one another, and glanced at the clock. Yet beneath it all, the air carried a strange tension, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Something was coming, something that would turn the balance upside down. And when it began, no one in that courtroom, least of all the judge, would forget it. The morning session in the courtroom began like any other, yet it did not take long for the cracks beneath the surface to show. The first defendant shuffled in, a man with hollow eyes who had clearly been there before. The lawyers exchanged papers, voices low but clipped, and the judge leaned back in his chair, his sharp tongue already ready to cut into whoever wasted his time. But it was during those early exchanges that the boy in the back caught the first hint of something. The way the judge mocked the attorney presenting the case, interrupting him with sarcasm that drew muffled laughter from the benches. It was routine cruelty, something the judge thought harmless, but to the boy, it meant something more. He watched closely, eyes narrowing, as though each word revealed another piece of a puzzle only he could see. The tension grew in small ways at first, in the rhythm of insults, the imbalance of respect. The judge thrived on control, using humiliation to keep order, to remind everyone who sat highest in that room. For the officers, this was nothing new. They had seen him reduce lawyers to stammering children and turn witnesses into nervous wrecks. But for the boy, who had already studied law far more deeply than anyone guessed, the cracks were glaring. Every unfair dismissal, every mocking tone, fed something inside him. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a quiet fire, a sense of injustice burning under his calm expression. In the days leading up to this trial, the judge had been under pressure too, though he would never admit it out loud. His position, once untouchable, had begun to feel more fragile. There were whispers in legal circles about complaints, murmurs of decisions questioned, even private criticism from colleagues who found his humor less amusing than cruel. Financial strain added weight as well, investments gone wrong, debts that gnawed at him in secret. At home, his marriage was fraying, silence replacing conversations. The robe gave him power during the day, but in the quiet of night, it was only cloth, and he could feel the truth pressing against his ribs. The boy had his own secrets too. To the world, he was just a student, his future unwritten. But behind closed doors, his nights were spent reading case law, dissecting rulings, and memorizing courtroom procedures. He had a gift for memory, for patterns, for catching the flaws that others missed. He admired the system's elegance, but hated its hypocrisy. And so he had crafted his own plan, not of violence, but of revelation. To step into the lion's den, not as prey, but as a mirror, forcing the beast to see itself. The real escalation began when the judge called for a recess. His mocking comments due ring the morning had already left the room tense, but during the break, whispers spread quickly. "He went too far this time," one man muttered near the door. "He embarrassed that lawyer in front of everyone." The boy listened quietly, catching every word. To most, these were passing complaints, the usual frustrations of those who had faced the judge's wit. To him, they were confirmation. The cracks weren't only visible to him, others had seen them too. When the court resumed, the boy did something no one expected. He rose from the bench at the back, walked forward with calm, steady steps, and stopped at the front. The room fell into a hush. His voice, when it came, was clear and firm. not the wavering tone of a nervous teenager, but the measured cadence of someone who belonged in that room. He asked permission to speak, his words deliberate, respectful but unshaken. At first, the judge laughed. The boy was young, far too young to be taken seriously. His laughter rolled through the room, sharp and dismissive, aimed not only at the boy, but at anyone who dared imagine this child had something to contribute. But the boy didn't flinch. He looked directly at the judge, and in that silence, something shifted. He began quoting cases, precedents the judge himself had cited in past rulings, word for word. His knowledge was not shallow. It ran deep, precise, and undeniable. The officers turned their heads, and the attorneys leaned forward. No one moved. The judge's laughter faded, his expression hardening into irritation, then something darker, unease. From that moment, the tension only grew sharper. The judge tried to dismiss him, raising his voice, calling him ridiculous, even mocking his age. But each insult only seemed to give the boy more strength. He countered calmly, each response lined with facts, rules and truths the judge could not deny. The boy didn't argue to win. He argued to reveal. And with each revelation, the power in the room began to tilt. Behind the judge's anger was fear, though he hid it well. Fear that someone younger, sharper, and unafraid had exposed his arrogance. Fear that his years of control could be undone by a single voice. He found himself thinking about the rumors again, the whispers about his declining respect. If even a boy could challenge him publicly, what would others begin to say? For the boy, the conflict was not just with the judge. It was also with himself. He had waited for this moment, prepared for it. But now that it was here, the weight pressed down on him. He wasn't just fighting for his own sense of justice. He was risking everything. If he failed, he could be laughed out of the room, dismissed as a foolish child. Worse, he could face punishment. His heart pounded beneath his calm exterior, but his resolve stayed firm. He had seen too many people crushed under authority that mocked rather than served. He would not let this chance slip away. The courtroom became a stage of shifting roles. The attorneys, once the center of attention, now sat silently, watching as a teenager sparred with a judge. The officers, who usually stood with easy authority, now looked uncertain, their eyes darting between the boy and the man they served. Even the onlookers, who had come expecting the usual dry proceedings, leaned forward, breath caught in their throats. They were witnessing something rare, something that felt almost dangerous. Each exchange between the boy and the judge deepened it cracks. The judge raised his voice. The boy stayed calm. The judge tried to twist his words. The boy untangled them, exposing the flaws with startling clarity. The tension grew unbearable, as if at any moment the balance would snap. But the conflict wasn't only in the room. It stretched beyond. At home, the judge's wife was already packing boxes, her patience worn thin after years of living under his shadow. His debts loomed larger, collectors circling like vultures, and in quiet conversations among his peers, his name was losing weight. Every outburst in court, every cruel joke, became part of the story that chipped away at his power. For the boy, there were pressures too. He came from a family that struggled, a house where bills piled up on the table, where the sound of arguments often drowned out the quiet. Education was supposed to be his escape, but opportunities came few and far between. His intelligence was his only weapon, the one thing that gave him a chance to rise above the weight pressing down on him. Standing in that courtroom wasn't just about the judge. It was about proving to himself, to his family, that his voice mattered. The unease in the courtroom thickened as the hours passed. Every person there could feel it, that something had shifted, that this was no longer just a case being argued. It was power itself on trial. The judge's anger began to crack, his words losing the sharp edge they once carried. The boy's confidence, though tested, only grew stronger. What started as a mocking dismissal had become a battle of pride, authority, and truth. By the end of the day, nothing in that courtroom felt the same. The judge sat heavier in his chair, his robe no longer a shield but a burden. The boy, though still young and ordinary in appearance, had become something more in the eyes of those who watched, a force that had dared to challenge the very system itself. The air hummed with a tension that could not yet break, but everyone could feel it building, rising toward something that none of them could yet name, but all of them knew was coming. The tension that had been simmering in the courtroom finally reached its breaking point on the third day. Everyone felt it before it happened, the way a storm makes the air heavy and restless before it breaks into thunder. The judge was already raw with anger, his pride shredded by the boy's relentless composure and the growing realization that the room was no longer fully his. His words, once sharp enough to silence a crowd, now fell flat against the boy's calm defiance. The people in the benches leaned forward, waiting, sensing that the air between them was too tight to hold. The boy stood again, not in hesitation but in quiet strength. His hands didn't shake, though his chest rose and fell faster than before. He had cornered the judge with one last precedent, a case the judge himself had once ruled on, twisting it now to show hypocrisy. The silence that followed was heavier than the gavel itself. The judge's face flushed red, his hand tightening around the wooden mallet as though it could anchor him. But power, once unquestioned, was slipping through his fingers. The breaking point came in a single moment of fury. The judge slammed the gavel so hard it cracked against the wood, the sharp sound jolting the room. His voice, booming and desperate, called the boy a fraud, a child pretending at games too dangerous for him. The boy didn't move, didn't lower his eyes. He simply stayed there. The stillness of his body a louder statement than any words. That stillness broke something inside the judge. He rose from his chair, towering above, and the air seemed to thicken. He was no longer the calm figure of law. He was a man exposed, stripped of control, his fear and rage spilling into violence. The officers shifted uneasily, unsure whether to step in or stand frozen in the surreal moment unfolding before them. And then it happened. The crime that would stain the walls of that courtroom forever. The judge, in a burst of uncontained fury, stepped down from the bench. His robe flared like dark wings, his eyes wild. The boy stood his ground, but he could see the shift. The line had been crossed, and reason had vanished. The judge's hand shot out, gripping the boy by the collar, yanking him forward with a force that drew gasps from the benches. Papers flew to the floor, the sound of shuffling feet echoing against the walls. The boy tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat as the judge slammed him against the polished table, the thud reverberating through the silent chamber. The violence wasn't planned. It was raw, unrestrained, born of humiliation and fear. In that moment, the judge wasn't thinking of law or order. He was thinking of power, of control slipping away, and of the desperate need to silence the boy who had exposed him. His hand pressed against the boy's chest, his other clenched in a fist that hovered for a moment, trembling with the weight of choice. Somewhere inside, a voice told him to stop, but the louder voice, the darker one, screamed that he had to act, that letting this boy continue meant the end of everything he had built. The blow landed, hard, unforgiving, across the boy's face. Gasps erupted, someone cried out. The officers finally surged forward, but it was already too late. The boy staggered back, dazed, his lips split, blood tracing down his chin. The room dissolved into chaos, shouts, chairs scraping, the pounding of boots. The judge's chest heaved, his hands shaking, the gavel lying cracked at his feet like a broken crown. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in shock. The boy's eyes locked on the judge's, and though his face was bruised, there was no fear in his gaze, only clarity, only a kind of sad knowing. He had forced the judge into the light, and the world had seen what he truly was. That truth stung more than any words could. The officers wrestled the judge back, his robe slipping off one shoulder, exposing him not as a figure of power, but as a man unraveling. He shouted, cursed, tried to twist free, his words wild and incoherent. The boy, supported by two onlookers, wiped the blood from his mouth and straightened his back. His voice, though quiet, cut through the noise. "This is the law you serve?" The immediate aftermath was madness. Some in the benches screamed, others tried to push their way out, their shoes squealing against the marble floor. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and the officers shouted for order that no longer existed. The once orderly courtroom had become a scene of raw panic, a stage where authority had devoured itself. The judge, pinned now by the weight of two officers, thrashed like a caged animal. His mind spun in denial. This wasn't him. This couldn't be happening. He tried to convince himself it was a moment of passion, a mistake, that the robe could still shield him. But deep down he knew the truth. He had crossed the line in front of witnesses, in front of the law itself. No explanation could erase what everyone had seen. The boy sat back down, pressing a cloth to his bleeding lip. Despite the pain, his thoughts were steady. He had expected resistance, anger, maybe even threats, but not this. And yet, in a strange way, it didn't surprise him. Power clung hardest when it was slipping away. He looked at the judge, and for the first time he didn't see a man above him. He saw someone broken, trapped in his own fear, undone by the very pride he had used to rule over others. The courtroom reeked of fear and adrenaline, the sharp tang of blood mixed with the smell of sweat and old wood. The echoes of shouting hung in the air long after the voices quieted. People stood still, their faces pale, their hands gripping the edges of benches as though they needed to hold on to something solid. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. In those chaotic minutes, the world turned upside down. A judge, once untouchable, had committed a crime in plain sight. A boy, mocked for his age, had stood taller than anyone imagined. The power dynamic that had always seemed unshakable crumbled in a single violent act. And though the room eventually fell silent, the echoes of that moment lingered like a wound that would never fully heal. It was more than just a crime. It was the shattering of illusion, the revelation of how fragile authority truly is when built on fear instead of respect. The gavel lay broken on the floor, and in its fractured wood was the truth that no one in that courtroom would ever forget. The courthouse, once filled with the sharp rhythm of routine, became heavy with silence after the outburst. The walls that had absorbed decades of rulings now carried the weight of scandal. The benches, where so many had sat waiting for judgment, still felt charged with what they had witnessed. No one forgot the sight of the judge's hand striking the boy. No one could unhear the gasp that had rippled through the room like a crack of thunder. It lingered in the air, in whispers that followed people as they left, in the hushed tones of officers speaking in corners. The judge was escorted away in restraints, his robe hanging awkwardly off his shoulders, his face pale, yet burning with rage and humiliation. To him, the moment felt unreal, as though he had been tricked into losing control. He muttered to himself that it wasn't his fault, that the boy had provoked him, that no one understood the pressure he lived under. Denial wrapped itself tightly around him, shielding him from the crushing truth. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's calm stare, unflinching, unbroken, even with blood dripping down his face. That stare haunted him, whispering a truth he could not silence. He had destroyed himself with his own hand. The boy, though treated for his injuries, carried the aftermath differently. His lip was stitched, his cheek swollen, but his mind felt sharper than ever. There was no satisfaction in what had happened, only a heavy ache. He had set out to reveal the cracks in authority, but he had not expected violence. In quiet moments, when the adrenaline faded, doubt crept in. Had he pushed too far? Had his determination to prove a point driven a man to the edge? Yet when he remembered the judge's hand gripping him, the blow that followed, he knew the truth lay deeper. The judge's rage had always been there, waiting to break free. He had not created it. He had only exposed it. The officers who had witnessed the act felt their own turmoil. They were trained to enforce order, to protect the dignity of the court, but many of them had served under this judge for years. They had respected him, some even admired him. To restrain him like a criminal was an act that shook their sense of loyalty. In private conversations, they argued. Some said the boy had goaded him. Others admitted the judge had always been cruel. And now everyone had finally seen the mask slip. Their trust in the system felt cracked, their faith in authority shaken. At home, the judge's family felt the ripple hardest. His wife, who had already been drifting away, now faced a storm of shame. Neighbors whispered, reporters camped outside, and every headline painted her husband not as a figure of justice, but as a man consumed by violence. She found herself torn between pity and disgust, remembering years of cold words, of conversations that turned into lectures. Their children, grown but still tied to his name, carried the weight of scandal everywhere they went. Employers questioned them, friends avoided them, and the once proud family name had turned into a curse. For the boy's family, the aftermath was complicated. They were proud, yes, proud that he had stood his ground, that he had revealed the truth so many had ignored. But fear ran through their home too. They worried about what would come next. Lawsuits, retaliation, the crushing weight of media attention. Strangers knocked at their door, reporters hungry for a quote, neighbors curious about the boy who had dared to stand against a judge. His parents argued late into the night, one saying he was a hero, the other fearing he had drawn their family into something they could never escape. The media seized the story with both hands. Headlines screamed about the judge who lost control, the teenager who stood against authority, and the courtroom turned battlefield. Television debates dissected every second of the incident. Some commentators called the boy a prodigy, a genius who had embarrassed a corrupt system. Others painted him as reckless, a provocateur who had baited a man already under immense pressure. The judge, once respected for his wit and stern rulings, was now reduced to sound bites that described him as violent, unstable, a disgrace to the bench. Public opinion split sharply. Many saw the boy as a symbol of truth, someone who had revealed the hypocrisy of those in power. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse in support, holding signs that read, "Justice needs reform." But others clung to the old image of the judge, unwilling to believe that someone they had trusted for years could fall so far. They spoke of his decades of service, his rulings that had shaped lives, and his reputation built over the years. The divide carved through the community, leaving arguments in coffee shops, living rooms, and classrooms. The psychological toll deepened as weeks passed. The judge sat in confinement, stripped of his robes, staring at bare walls that reflected his emptiness. He laid the moment endlessly in his mind, sometimes seeing himself as a victim of provocation, other times feeling the crushing weight of guilt. His pride, once unshakable, was now fragile shards that cut into him whenever he tried to hold them. He wrote letters to his wife that went unanswered, tried to draft statements that might salvage his name, but everything he touched felt hollow. The boy, though praised publicly, felt the invisible scars inside. Strangers called him brave, lawyers reached out with offers, journalists sought interviews, but he found no peace in their admiration. The memory of the gavel cracking, the judge's wild eyes, the fist slamming into his face, it played over and over in his head, unshakable. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought dreams where the judge's shadow loomed endlessly, chasing him through echoing halls. He had won a battle, yes, but at the cost of innocence. His belief in justice, once pure, was now stained with the knowledge of how quickly power could twist into violence. The community itself changed. The courthouse became a place people spoke of in hushed tones, its walls marked by scandal. Trials held there afterward felt different, the atmosphere heavier, the memory of what had happened never far away. Young students spoke of the boy with awe, some inspired to study law themselves, others fearful of what standing up to power might bring. Older citizens debated endlessly, some clinging to the past, others embracing the call for reform. The falling action of that day stretched far beyond the courtroom. It touched families, friendships, reputations, and the very fabric of trust in the system. The judge's name, once synonymous with authority, became a cautionary tale. The boy's story, though celebrated, became a reminder of how thin the line is between courage and danger. And for everyone who had been there, who had witnessed the breaking of power, the memory lived on like a scar, one that could not be hidden, only carried. When the dust finally settled, the courtroom no longer felt like the same place. The trial that followed was not about the case that had originally brought people in, but about the judge himself. The man who had once sat above all others now found himself sitting lower than everyone else in a chair meant for the accused. His robe was gone, his authority stripped, and all that remained was the man, tired, bitter, and broken. The evidence was undeniable. Dozens of witnesses had seen him strike the boy. Cameras had caught the moment, and reporters had spread the images across every screen in the country. The law he had once used to bend others now bent itself around him, leaving no escape. The verdict was swift: removal from the bench, disbarment, and an assault conviction. It wasn't the kind of sentence that would put him away for decades, but it was enough to erase the life he had built. His reputation was gone, his family distanced themselves, and the community that once respected him could barely say his name without bitterness. He became a man people whispered about in the past tense, as though he had already vanished. To him, that was the deepest punishment. Not prison walls or fines, but the silence of being forgotten by the very system he had once ruled. For the boy, life moved forward differently. He was praised publicly, labeled a prodigy, and even called a symbol of courage. Oh, opportunities came flooding in: scholarships, invitations to speak, letters from lawyers and judges across the country who admired his bravery. Yet he carried it all with quiet restraint. Inside, he knew the truth was more complicated. He hadn't sought fame, only fairness. He hadn't wanted to break a man, only to reveal the cracks in the system. He walked away with scars, both physical and hidden, and though people tried to crown him a hero, he never fully embraced the title. What mattered to him most was the lesson, that even the strongest mask of authority can crumble when faced with truth. The officers who had restrained the judge lived with their own quiet reflection. They had been forced to act against the very figure they were trained to uphold. Some confessed privately that it shook their faith. Others admitted it gave them clarity. No one, not even a judge, should be above the law. Their loyalty shifted, no longer tied blindly to rank or robe, but to the idea of justice itself. That shift, though subtle, rippled outward into how they carried out their duties. The community remained divided for months. Some argued that the judge had been pushed, provoked, that his years of service should outweigh a single mistake. Others insisted that the moment revealed his true nature, one that had been hidden behind robes and rituals for too long. But slowly, as more details came out, complaints he had ignored, harsh rulings that seemed more personal than fair, the scales tipped. People began to see the pattern, to realize that the outburst wasn't an accident, but the inevitable breaking point of a man who had long believed himself untouchable. The media moved on eventually, but not before leaving its mark. Documentaries were filmed, articles written, and op-eds debated. The boy's story was retold countless times, each version bending slightly, some painting him as a fearless genius, others as a child caught in a storm too big for him. The truth lived somewhere in between, but in every telling, one theme remained. Power, once unchecked, had finally been confronted. On a broader scale, The case became a spark for conversation about accountability in positions of authority. Judges, once considered beyond reproach, were now scrutinized more closely. Courtrooms added new oversight measures, complaints were handled with greater seriousness, and the myth of untouchable authority cracked just a little more. Students studying law spoke of the case as a turning point, not for its legal complexity, but for its moral weight. For the judge, the years that followed were heavy. He lived quietly, away from the public eye, haunted by the moment that had undone him. Sometimes he tried to justify it to himself, telling the story in his mind as though he had been trapped, provoked, forced. But in the quiet of the night, when no one listened, he faced the truth. It had been his choice. His hand, his fist, his loss of control. That truth ate at him more than the punishment ever could. The boy, in contrast, grew into the role that life had thrust upon him. He pursued law formally, channeling his sharp mind and steady courage into a career that promised change. Yet he carried a humility with him, a quiet reminder of what he had seen. He never forgot the look in the judge's eyes, the mixture of rage and fear, nor the weight of standing against someone who held so much power. It shaped him, not into someone who sought glory, but into someone who sought balance, who understood that justice was fragile and needed constant guarding. The story, in the end, was not just about a crime. It was about the fragile line between authority and abuse, about how pride can blind a man, and how truth can come from the most unexpected places, even the mouth of a boy. It showed that power, no matter how high it sits, is still human, still flawed, and still vulnerable when challenged. For society, it was a reminder of uncomfortable truths. That respect should not be given blindly, that justice should not depend on titles or robes, and that the fight for fairness often comes at a personal cost. It made people question their own silence in the face of arrogance, their own willingness to accept cruelty disguised as wit. It forced a reckoning, not just in law, but in human behavior itself. In the quiet years that followed, the courthouse returned to routine. New judges sat on the bench, new cases filled the docket, and life moved forward. But those who had been there never forgot. They remembered the sound of the gavel cracking, the sight of the robe falling from a man's shoulder, the boy's calm voice cutting through chaos. They remembered how fragile the mask of authority truly was, and how, for one brief moment, truth had stood taller than power. And perhaps that was the deepest lesson of all, that justice is not in the robe, nor in the gavel, nor in the man who sits above. It is in the courage to speak, the strength to resist, and the willingness to see even those in power as human, capable of falling, capable of failing, just like anyone else.